Thank you, Mikey.
Yeah.
I don't know. You need a microphone?
No, I think I'm good. You guys can hear
Good.
me. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for introduction. As you have seen, that Afikra is a really interesting platform. But my question is, Mikey, this platform was generated for, as you said, Arabs who are living in the West, or you are generally for all Arabs and non-Arabs who are interested in the Middle East cultural and knowledge, history?
So I don't think of it in terms of that dichotomy. It's for anyone who cares about this region. Whether that person is, as we were talking before, whether that is your son who is living in LA, or your daughter who is living in Rome, or your nephew who's living in Jeddah, or your niece who's living in Beirut, or their best friend who lives in Berlin. I don't care. What I care about is if somebody says they have an active interest in this region, that's not good enough. A passive interest is not good enough. So I invite them and I actually challenge them to exercise their agency and be a part of the way we collectively think about this place. That's kind of a cagey, sort of cheeky answer, so I'll give you what I think you're asking, which is, since our very first event, we've had people who showed up to the events who are not Arab at all. That word is not in the first paragraph of who they say they are. But 80% of people who are in that community, who are in Africa's community, are connected to the Arab world somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. Some scholars believe that creativity comes with the language.
Yeah.
When you know a language, you can be creative, you can be a novelist, you can be a poetry. And Arab has been, the language is very historical since before Islam and after Islam. The language plays a major part of their history and their culture.
Yeah.
Your platform doesn't have Arabic content as it should be. Do you believe that because of the change in the generation, that my daughter and my son are interesting to listen to more English-speaking contents more than Arabic?
So we definitely need more. We need more interesting Arabic content, definitely. But we need just more interesting content. Period.
Okay.
The reason why I think your son and your daughter, as an example, are more interested in watching shows on HBO in English than they are watching shows in Arabic is not because of the language. It's because the shows are better.
Yes, I can agree.
Yeah, and that is, that's a sort of a laugh line, but there's something deeper to that. There's something deeper. It goes back to the New York example, the Boardwalk Empire example, right? Somebody made that show. Why don't we have Boardwalk Empire in Arabic? The reason why we don't have it in Arabic is because, we were talking about this earlier, largely people in the region are not curious. Mm-hmm. There's an anti-intellectualism associated with curiosity. People largely have a hard time asking questions. Like, for example, who's ever been to a dinner party where the smartest person in the room just talks and talks and talks and talks and doesn't listen to anyone else? Right? Exactly. Who's watched an interview where the interviewer doesn't even ask a question? You're asking questions, right? And just says well, I think da 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 da. What do you agree? Right? That's what we think intellectualism looks like in the Arab world is filibustering. It's just talking, having a strong opinion, being controversial. Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. We don't see actual question marks. We don't see people saying, I don't know about this. Can you help me about, for example, I want to interview you more than I think you want to interview me. So, for example, I want to know, you're a lawyer, you've worked in Saudi Arabia for a long time. How has tort reform changed in Saudi? I'm so curious. So, you know so much about this, I don't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the country's opening up like crazy. It's like, how is the legal structure like playing catch up?
Exactly.
There's so many interesting questions to ask. Who cares about the languages we're speaking in right now? Much more important than the language that we're speaking in is the ability to ask questions in any language and having a connection to this place. So yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I share the same feelings because also I teach in one of the university, I teach law, and you don't see that the young generation have this hunger to ask and no curiosity. You want to read the textbook and you get to be marked and that's it, and leave the university with the degree and that's it. No curiosity to do any exercise, to do research, to know anything. So in our area of practice, because Saudi Arabia is a Muslim country and we apply Islamic law, Sharia, and then we have modern law. Yeah. There is a gap. Nobody is trying to bridge the gap between these two important factors of developing our legal platform or legal framework in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Coming to next questions, I believe, طبعا, because of my age, I have seen part of the golden area of the Arab world where we can have the examples of Najib Mahfouz, Kulthum, Fairuz, and others. That was the golden era of the Arab world. Do you believe that the young generation is not following the Arab music or the Arab books because there is no such superstars, an example?
It's a great question. I'm a musician. I studied music. My whole family is filled with musicians. And a couple years ago, I was sitting with my brother, who's also a musician, and I said, I have a controversial opinion. I think Arabic music sucks. Right? I was like, I gotta be honest. I just think we're bad at it. Like, we're good at food and we're good at this, and we're not good at this. Right? Like Russians are great at dance. Their food sucks. So let's call it a spade a spade. And he was like, you're a dumbass. Right? Like, you are so dumb. This is don't die on this hill. This is a bad take. Okay, so because I embrace the fact that I'm largely ignorant about most things, I said, okay, I'm going to start a music series. So a couple years ago, we started Quarter Tones, which is an interview series focused on music.
Exactly.
And every 2 weeks, I interview somebody who is either studying music or mostly making award-winning music. And what I've found is there are incredible musicians expanding what it means to make Arabic music. Yeah, they're not making Kulthum's work. Definitely, right? But they're making other stuff. And if we don't, as a listening public, broaden our own understanding of what music from this region is, then we're only going to be living in this nostalgic past. Like, there's a great essay. Khalil Gibran, when he was living in New York, wrote an essay saying, "You have your Arabic, I have mine." Which, if you're Lebanese, Khalil Gibran is like this figure who's supposed to be like, the perfect Arabic. And it's hilarious to imagine that there was a moment in time when this guy who was writing in Arabic was largely criticized for speaking broken Arabic. This guy was considered ajnabi. You're in New York. You make grammatical mistakes. You're not part of the golden age. You don't write like Mutanabbi. Write exactly like him or don't write at all. And this guy at the time wrote this essay, "You have your Arabic, I have mine." It's the exact same thing as a Iraqi rapper who's saying, "I'm making Arabic music. I'm speaking Arabic, I live in Iraq, I'm making Arabic music. You have your music, I have mine." So what we do is we try to explore all these different alleyways and all these different things and not celebrate them blindly, but explore, why do people like this? And once you do that, you start to find amazing things, Like, I'll give you one, speaking of rap. One of my favorite musicians making Arabic music now is this guy named Chino. Chino is Filipino-Syrian, grew up in Beirut, okay?
Chino.
His mother is Syrian, his father is Filipino. He grew up in, بالعكس. His father is Syrian, his mother is Filipino. He grew up in Beirut. He's making, as far as I'm concerned, the most Arabic music I've ever heard. And this is the Arab world I grew up in, right? So that music is like overwhelmingly beautiful and incredible. And if we cast him aside and say, Tab, you're not making Arabic music, we will lose every nephew and niece.
Yes.
And they're not gonna care about this region. So that's a little bit of a sidetrack, but that's how I feel about it.
Thank you. I don't want to make this look like a legal interrogation. So, so we'll open up for Q&A. Please, Abdurrahman, sir.
Yes, speak loudly. There's a mic.
Mic coming.
And since you're all connected to Wi-Fi, if you'd like to look us up, that's the website. And if you want to look us up on social media, you can do that as well. Yeah, sorry. Hold up.
All right, thank you, Mikey. I love this. Actually, a beautiful idea. My name is Abdurrahman Fawzan. I'm an engineer at Facebook in California. Actually, the question you asked at the beginning, if someone heard of Al-Fikra, so actually, seeing the names, I actually recognize two people. Sultan Al-Qasimi is a good friend,
Yeah.
and actually he's part of this. So I guess if you asked again, I would raise my hand.
Perfect,
Also, Yasmin Al-Khwaiter, I think I noticed she gave a talk. She's a friend we talked about her representation, I think, 3 weeks ago in Boston.
Yeah.
She gave, I think, one of the fun talks. Cool. The question I have here is, so I enjoyed, being involved in culture and non-academic things since even college. And I was involved with a non-profit called Tarjimli. Probably two of my good friends started. I spent like 2 years on it as a volunteer, founding member. Another one called, while I was at MIT, we did something called MENA Fair, which was bringing employers in the Middle East to do a career fair at MIT to try to hire people who want to work in the Middle East.
Great.
And there's a few others. The question I have here is about sustainability. Doing these ones, and Tarjimli and others, at least the ones I've been involved with, starting these and running them for a couple of years is hard. And keeping them running for a while is even harder too.
Yeah.
And I would, since I really love this and I would hope to see it continue for a while and forever, maybe you can tell us about the challenge of running a sustainable cultural ambition or a cultural project like this one.
Great.
Like I'm sure you're the founding member of the team, and we'd want to see this after you as a legacy.
Yeah. That's a great
just want to see what your thoughts are.
I love this question. So in a previous life, I started an education nonprofit. So I was a school teacher. After being a school teacher, I started an education nonprofit and made the mistake of raising money right away and going out and saying, give me money. I have a great idea. Right? It was focused on students from the 9th Ward who had gotten into college but dropped out and were saddled with loans and were worse off than they would have been if they didn't go to college to begin with. And I raised all this money and realized that my whole plan was unsustainable. So when I started Al-Fikra, I was working at Morgan Stanley in New York, and before asking for $1 from anyone, I wanted to answer 3 questions. And anytime I talk about this to anyone, I tell them to answer these 3 questions when they're starting something that, if you squint your eyes, kind of looks like a nonprofit. The first is, are you good at this? Do you have evidence that you're actually good at this? 2, does anybody want this? You're giving it away for free. Do they actually want it? And 3, do you want to do it for the next 10 years? And so for the first 2 years, I had to answer those questions. Alhamdulillah, all 3 of them were yes. Then we raised money from the community, very similar to Wikipedia. So I went around and said, can you spare $10? Can you spare $100? I had a full-time job, so there weren't that many expenses. That sustained the first couple of years. Up until 2 years ago, I was running a consulting firm, so there was very little expenses. 2 years ago, I realized, okay, I don't really believe in nonprofits. That's a different conversation, but I don't really believe in them. And so I said, I need to find a way to sustain. And so what we've landed on is very similar to the TED model, which is basically 10% of what of our expenses come from crowdsource, the community. People give $10, $100 a month, that type of thing. That's about 10%. Another 20% come from folks who are on our board, who believe in the mission and believe in the big picture, people like Sultan, and I showed the board earlier, who believe in the big picture challenge that we're trying to overcome and the movement that we're trying to build. And the final 70% come from partners. educational institutions like NYU, cultural institutions like El Sirkal, folks like YouTube, who believe in what we're doing and quite frankly value us to do something for them. Not grants, not weird grant boards and strange things like that, but just say, you do this extremely well, and we want you to do this because your work furthers what we want in the world, and we will pay you to do that. And so that's how we operate. Yeah.
Here, the gentleman here.
Hi there. I just had a quick scroll through. How do you deal with politics in this
love this
forum?
question.
Do you avoid it? Do you embrace it? And if you embrace it, how are you going to deal with the danger that you will come up against people who don't like talking about politics, governments, for instance?
Yeah. I love this question. It's right behind you.
Thank you for saving me from this question. You took it.
So one of our core values, and I would say, I can go through all 5 of our core values real quick. So our core values are contribution over consumption. We're expecting people to contribute to every single conversation. 2, curiosity over promotionalism, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm somehow forgetting all of our core values. Interest over identity. There's one that I'm forgetting. Oh, inclusivity over something, and the last one is kindness above all. But I want to talk about the second one, which is curiosity over promotionalism. People think that being political and being promotional are the same thing. That's not true. And I really push that issue. You can talk about stuff that is related to politics quite easily, actually, if you don't have a horse in the race, if you are actually curious about it. So we were talking earlier on a break, and I was saying, let's use a benign example. Let's say I'm like, Fayrouz is the best singer ever. I have an agenda. That's the talk I want to give. That type of talk would not be allowed in Al-Fikra. Even though it's benign, who's going to get that mad about it? But if somebody else who's not that familiar with Fayrouz asks a question that says, what's the fuss with Fayrouz? What's the big deal about her? Every Lebanese friend I have has a tattoo of her on their arm. What's the big deal, right? That is not promotional. That's based on curiosity. And that would be allowed. Even though it's kind of the same subject matter, it's the approach that's different. And that's the exact same thing is true about any topics that are political. I'll give you an example. I presented one of the a topic that I presented many years ago was about Ammar Sharif, the actor. It was just when he died. And the presentation topic name was, why have I always known the name Ammar Sharif but nothing else about him? Right? That's how I felt. It's an authentic question. I started doing research. Turns out it's like a hugely political issue. He was excommunicated. It's a very, the
very
story.
Sensitive, yes.
Very sensitive. But because I don't actually have a horse in the race, and because I'm forced to say our Al-Fikra presenter promise at the beginning of every presentation, where I promise to not be an expert in this, I promise that somebody here might know more than me, I promise that I don't have an agenda, all of a sudden it just deflates the whole situation. And I'm literally trying to ask and answer a question authentically. Another presentation. This is another one of my favorite presentations of all time. It was about the history of the tomato, right? The question was, what did food from the Arab world taste like before the tomato arrived? Which for me, I'm like, what do you mean, when did it arrive? I have no idea. And so, turns out, I'll finish in a second. It turns out that the Wikipedia article for the history of the tomato has more edits on it than the Arab-Israeli crisis Wikipedia page. It is a deeply political topic.
Like hummus, yeah.
Like hummus, right?
Hummus, yeah.
As it turns out, it's crazy. But she had no idea, so she just presented it. And the same thing is true with politics. So we can and if there's a hill that I'd like to die on in the Arab world, it is please talk about political subjects. but not promotionally. Literally, authentically be curious about it. To learn more without forcing an agenda down everybody's throat. Just like get over yourself for a second.
Thank you, Mikey, and thanks everyone.